The United States National Security Strategy and the Road to the United States of the Americas. That's what we're going to talk about this week on Milkshakes Markets and Madness. So it was a fairly quiet week in the overall financial markets. We'll cover those at the end of this. We'll go over some charts. But for me, the news that kind of dominated the week was the release of the United States National Security Strategy for 2025. And there's been various takes on this document, but regardless of what your take on it is, I think it is without question a very important document. And so for those who are not aware of it or have not already seen it, I thought what we would do today is kind of go through and summarize what it said and talk about why it's important. Now, interestingly, we have discussed this topic several times on this show this year. And so while it is somewhat repetitive, part of the reason we're repeating it is because we think it is important and we think it bears further scrutiny and consistent scrutiny. And part of the reason, again, something that we have talked about several times, is that we think we are now in an environment where politics and power and national security and national interest trumps, pardon the pun, normal economic analysis. In other words, some projects that may not pencil out on a spreadsheet from an economic perspective may happen anyway. And projects that pencil out on a spreadsheet may not be successful due to power dynamics and geopolitical alignments and that type of stuff. So we just, as investors, we don't think it is possible to ignore the broader geopolitical, let's just call it alignments and factors as perhaps it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. So let me just pull, what I did is I just went through and summarized the document. We'll just walk through 6 or 7 slides that kind of summarize the different things, and we'll go into a little bit of detail on some of them. But again, for those who are not familiar with it, wrong one. All right, hold on. Those not familiar with it, this is a document that's put out by the White House that summarizes the overall national security strategy that the administration is employing. Now, some of you who have been watching me for a while have probably heard me talk about the United States of the Americas. And it's kind of tongue-in-cheek and kind of a joke, but, part of the reason that it resonates is there's a little bit of truth in every joke. And I think this is the ultimate goal kind of the United States. I mean, I think they would love to they already dominate the Western Hemisphere, but I think they want to have even more control of the Western Hemisphere. And I don't think that is a super great insight. I think a lot of people kind of believe that. But I think there's a bigger potential for it actually happening than some other people. And so we'll talk about what some of those reasons are. But just from a big picture standpoint, here's the executive summary of this document, essentially saying that the strategy shifts to core national interests and U.S. primary drivers or U.S. sovereignty as primary drivers. For years and years and years, the rules-based order was a somewhat multilateral strategy, which favored many countries in the West rather than just the United States. But that, with Trump coming in, that has been torn apart and rewritten. And so they're shifting from global activism to only U.S. aligned engagements. And this is a strategy of a singular economic, industrial, and technological strategy where rather than doing all these in siloed events, it is a coordinated effort. And finally, they're going to prioritize deterrence rather than intervention, and clarity, being very specific about what they're trying to achieve as opposed to expansive commitments around the world. I mean, that's the summary. Again, these are words. We'll see whether these actually play out, but this is what the document is saying. As far as the core national interests, again, they are only going to do something that has a direct benefit to the United States. It's no longer for the greater good. It's for the greater good of the United States. And then only going to engage when it's justified and it strengthens the United States in some way or provides more security. And it is now a transactional relationship. We're going to do this for you, but in exchange, we are going to get this. And again, it's more of a transactional, one-on-one, unilateral form of governance as opposed to multilateral. And obviously, the goal is to reduce long-term engagements, especially military, if there is no predefined goal of outcome. Now, as far as the Western Hemisphere goes, and this gets back to the United States of the Americas, this is kind of people have declared it, rather than the Monroe Doctrine, it's the Donroe Doctrine, and I think that's right. But I think, as we have said many times on this show, even though this is all happening in the Western Hemisphere, or the focus is going to be in the Western Hemisphere, it's still about China, right? That's what all of this stuff is about, this big, great game between the global powers who are fighting for dominance. And even though the focus is on the Western Hemisphere, it is about containing China and keeping them out of our sphere of influence. And again, I don't think that's some great insight either. I think many people realize that. But I think the forcefulness which they are going to do it is what is new here. And again, they're going to emphasize border security, migration control, and regional stability. And they've said that they're going to strengthen the cooperation with established regional partners. That means in the Western Hemisphere. But they also said that they're going to establish, relationships with new partners. So, when you've seen, Trump has already sent envoys to Panama and Guatemala and El Salvador. And I think that is going to continue to happen. And I think this is going to become a much more integrated region than it has previously been. And, they specifically said, we will prevent non-hemispheric powers from establishing, a foothold in the Americas. And I mean, that is a direct reference to China. China made great inroads to Argentina. That is over. They made great inroads in Panama. That is over. They made great inroads into Venezuela and Peru. That is on the way to being over. And I think, the presence of the U.S. military in the Caribbean is a pretty good indicator of how seriously they're taking it. And I think there's a lot of people out here who view this as a retreat, and as the U.S. can no longer enforce its will on the whole world. And first thing I'd say is, I don't know that the U.S. could ever enforce its whole will on the rest of the world, but it certainly had the ability to do it to more than any other country. And the idea that they no longer will do that, I think, is a misread of this document. There is no question that they are prioritizing the Western Hemisphere, but nowhere in there did they say they will no longer be involved in other areas if it is in their interest to do so. So I think anybody who has read this as a strategic retreat and something that the United States can no longer, enforce, or at least exert its will in other parts of the world, is to misread the document. But there's no question that the Western Hemisphere is the priority. Now, the part that generated probably the most firestorm and the biggest comments was its attitude towards Europe. And if you actually read what they said, on the one hand, it's totally rational, but on the other hand, it's a bit shocking just because it's never been said out loud before, especially by the leadership of the United States. And what they said is, Europe remains, important, and it's a long-term ally, but it is no longer the automatic centerpiece of global strategy. And here's the thing is, now people are somewhat criticizing this, but at the same time, they've always criticized the United States for meddling in other parts of the world. And so now that the U.S. is saying, well, you know what? You need to take care of yourself. Now people are upset about that as well. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy there. But again, this part of the document probably created the most headlines and most quoted lines. And it really goes back to NATO, the commitments and the burden sharing. Earlier this year, Trump basically demanded that European countries spend 5% of their GDP on national defense rather than relying mostly on the United States. And, that seems a pretty logical, thing to me. The idea that the United States should fund and provide all the military defense for Europe is a bit silly. And I think it's hard to argue against that. And so I think, Europe is now going to be forced because this is not the Europeans deciding to do this. They should have decided to do this years ago and never did. But Europe is now expected to take a greater responsibility for its own defense in its own neighborhood. And that's kind of directly related to Ukraine. And you can see the funny thing about this is Europe so badly wants to continue fighting this war with Ukraine, but they want the United States to mostly fund it and provide equipment for it, and potentially even provide, military assets for it. But Europe also continues to buy all kinds of energy from Russia. So, make up your mind. If you really view Russia as this national threat, then stop buying all their energy and providing them the funds that you believe they are now going to use to invade you. So, but this is the United States kind of putting its foot down and saying, listen, we will help when necessary, but only if it's in the greater interest of the United States and not just because we have been longtime allies with Europe. And they even, the phrase that got the most attention was when they said Europe faces civilizational erasure and may one day lose its status as a reliable U.S. ally. So I think, that's obviously, created some hard feelings between some of the European leaders and the United States. But one thing I would say here is, I think even though the United States has been the primary power since World War II, I think in many ways the Europe, or at least certain factions within Europe, have still continued to kind of turn their nose up at the crude Americans who just don't quite understand how powerful Europe actually is, and to a certain extent have continued to think that we're just a bunch of cowboys who don't really understand the world and culture, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is a bit of a wake up for Europe as far as what they are going to need to do if they want to maintain their place in the world. And I think they've got a very long road to go to do that. As far as Indo-Pacific and Taiwan, this is where, again, the U.S. has not said we are retreating from this area. They actually say in there, Taiwan remains a central deterrence focal point. So I think there's been some speculation that the United States is going to get, the Western Hemisphere and Venezuela. Russia is going to get Ukraine, and China is going to get Taiwan. And this is a backroom deal that has been negotiated. And listen, is that impossible? No, that's not impossible. I mean, I certainly think we're going towards regionalization rather than globalization, but I don't think it's a given. And I have a hard time believing that at this point, maybe some point in the future, but I think if it was decided right now, I don't think the United States would just abandon Taiwan because there's some backroom deal. Again, I can't say for sure, but I think if you actually read this document, what it says, rather than what you think you want it to say, it's not quite as clear as many people think. And again, it says in there the U.S. opposes this unilateral change in the Taiwan Strait, and they have specifically said we will maintain military overmatch so that no adversary miscalculates and triggers a conflict in the arena or in the area. So, when you say you are going to maintain military overmatch, that's not exactly saying we are going to shrink back into our domestic market and you guys just go do whatever you want to do. But I think that rather than just being the world's police, it is now going to be more targeted, incursions, so to speak. But the other part was they really focused on the economy and technology. And, we have talked several times about the Big Beautiful Bill, and a section of that is the Office of Strategic Capital. And I continue to believe this Office of Strategic Capital is a much bigger and more important thing than people realize. This is a direct response to China's power in this arena, and they are going to focus on critical minerals, dual use technologies, anything that is specifically geared towards United States supply chain independence or national security interests, they are going to focus on that. And whether that will work perfectly, it probably will not work perfectly. But the fact that the United States now has its goals squarely focused on this arena, I think should make the rest of the world kind of wake up and take notice of that. I mean, when they say we will rebuild the American industrial base with a particular focus on critical minerals, semiconductors, maritime logistics, and dual-use manufacturing, I don't think you can ignore that. Again, I don't think you can just accept it as a given that it's going to work perfectly, but to say that it won't work at all and that the United States' best days are behind it, I think is being extremely naive when you think about the ramifications of it. Another interesting part was the reduced Middle East focus. But again, I think some are misreading this. They didn't say we are no longer going to be involved. They didn't say that it is no longer important. What they said is a retreat from kind of these ideology-driven missions. And, they are going to refocus, power in other directions. But it didn't say they are going to ignore anything. And I think the idea that if some kind of a conflict broke out in the Middle East, that the United States would just sit back and let it happen, I think that's probably wrong. But I think the big quote from that section was, but it says, but the days in which the Middle East dominated American foreign policy in both long-term planning and day-to-day execution are thankfully over. And I think if this turns out to be the case, many people will be happy about this. I think we have been involved in much too great of an extent in the Middle East. I don't think that we're pulling back, but if we did, I don't think too many people would be too upset about that. But it goes on to say, not because the Middle East is no longer matters. And again, I think that's very important. They're not saying it's not important. They're just saying that because it is no longer the constant irritant, because of some of the progress they have made and the relationship that Trump has with some of the players in the region, that is no longer a potential source of imminent catastrophe than it once was. But that's not to say that if something broke out, that they would not, then refocus on this area. So I think be careful as far as saying what it says and what it doesn't say. And then finally, Africa. I think this is rather interesting because, it said Africa is viewed through a lens of strategic competition and selective engagement. There's no question that China has made great inroads into into Africa over the last couple of decades. And that has probably been to the detriment of the United States from a strategic standpoint. But I think while they will still kind of prioritize important parts of opportunities that they see, it is not necessarily going to be a focus because the focus now has been more in the Western Hemisphere. But to the extent that partnering or having some kind of a relationship or some kind of initiatives with Africa is a way to either thwart China or prioritize and influence or keep China's influence from growing, I would expect that they will probably continue to do that. But finally, just in summary on this, it's definitely without question a narrower interest first doctrine, and it replaces kind of the global police mantra that it had for many years. It focuses on sovereignty, deterrence, and economic power. More of a prioritization of the Western Hemisphere as the rest of the world. And I think the commentary that has been that this is the United States retreating, I think is the wrong framework. Retreat kind of implies that the United States no longer has a choice and this is being forced on them. That is completely wrong. This is the United States finally prioritizing the Western Hemisphere as opposed to being forced to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And, I would argue that Trump has done more to change the world and tear down the traditional rules-based order in 1 year than the BRICS accomplished in 15. So none of this is being forced on the United States. The United States is just choosing to do this. And I think when you frame it as a retreat, you're misunderstanding what's actually happening. This is the United States choosing to go about it this way. Nobody is forcing them to go about this way. And if they were to decide to do something different in the future, I don't know that there's anybody that could keep them from doing it, or at least nobody that could stop them from at least trying to do it. But listen, if the United States really does pull back to the Western Hemisphere and it becomes less involved in other parts of the world, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. And if I'm wrong about them still wanting to influence things on the other side of the world that aren't directly related to the Western Hemisphere, I'll be totally fine with being wrong about that. I think in many ways these national priorities are appropriate, and it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how this plays out in the year ahead. But I do think, going back to the Western Hemisphere, I think the Western Hemisphere is going to become much more integrated than it historically has been. Now, whether it ever becomes the United States of the Americas, I suppose, that's perhaps a bit much. But I do think that is the direction in which it is headed. So anyway, if this is the first time you're hearing about this kind of stuff and you like this topic, check us out at santiagocapital.com. You can also go to research.santiagocapital.com, which is where we write about a lot of this stuff. We've kind of focused on the intersection of geopolitics, capital markets, and the madness of crowds. And so we would love to have you join us over there. Now, the other thing, I wanted to run through some charts here. Let me pull these up here. We won't spend a lot of time here, but I'll just kind of show you what I'm thinking right now. So this is the VIX, and you can see, the VIX is back down as its lows. Had a little bit of spike in November. We got a little bit of a correction in the markets. Didn't last very long. And now the VIX is back basically at the lows of the year. The other thing is, if we look at the put-call ratio, is now basically at the lows of the year and pretty close to as low as it's been any time in the last 10 years. So there's not a whole lot of fear in the market right now with the VIX at 15, the put-call ratio near its lows. There's not a lot of people expecting great volatility. That's one. If we go to here's a chart of the Dow. I haven't. This is my first chance looking at these this week, or in the last couple of days. So you're going to see kind of what I see for the first time. But you all know I was expecting a correction in Q3. We never got it. We did get a little bit of a correction here in November. Pulled back to the 100-day moving average, bounced perfectly off that, and has now started to retrace higher. When I look at the stochastics and the RSI, they're both kind of in neutral territory. So nothing is really jumping out at me as far as a dramatic change in short order on this chart. If we go to the S&P 500, we see the exact same thing. This correction that we got in November, this is what I was expecting back in September, October. I thought we were going to get this pullback to this, 10, 100-day moving average, maybe even the 200-day moving average, back in this area. But it took a couple more months to develop, and it kind of hit there and it bounced perfectly off of it. Same thing as if we go over to the NASDAQ. We didn't get a correction in Q3, but we sort of got one here in Q4. Again, bounced perfectly off the 100-day moving average. Stochastics came down a lot and have rebounded. Relative strength relative strength is kind of in neutral territory. Stochastics crashed in November, but now they're on the rise again. But nothing really jumping out to me on these charts right here. This one is starting to get interesting. So the reason is because the Russell, it actually broke the 200-day moving average, and then it's had a huge rebound higher, now at the high of the year. If we go back and just look at these, we're not quite back to the high of the year in the NASDAQ, not quite back to the high of the year in the S&P, not quite back to the high of the year in the Dow. But if we go to the Russell, we've actually made new highs. Relative strength has kind of rebounded. It's starting to roll over a little bit, and the stochastics are getting pretty high. So it would not be surprising to me to see a pullback in the Russell, which is the kind of the small and medium-sized companies. This is a pretty interesting chart. So this is the gold versus the commercial shorts. Now the problem with this is these are very delayed due to the government shutdown. You can see here, this is still only as of the end of October, but you can see that in the pink line, this is the commercials who had their short position. As gold rallied in October, you can see this commercial short position was getting closed out. So they were covering their shorts. Now, you can also see, though, that October 21st was when gold made its high, and that's kind of when this made its high. And this is starting to turn back down. So I'm really curious to see what this looks like as this new information gets released. And the same with silver. Silver looks to be, the big move looks to be driven by commercial short covering as well. In any case, that is what we have going on this week. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. Hope you guys all had a great Thanksgiving last week, and looking forward to talking to you again next one. Bye-bye.